Hey everyone, I'm Rick Beato. In today's episode, we're going to talk about phase relationships. Really, how to get your microphones in phase. Anytime you have more than one mic on a sound source, you have to deal with phase relationships. You heard that term, oh, this is in phase or out of phase. Well, I'm going to explain what that means. To begin, we need to actually look at the components of a sound wave. So I drew out a sine wave here. Amplitude is how far above or below the center line is. That's the x-axis, which is time, amount of time here. The peak of the sound wave above the x-axis is called the crest, and the lowest point is called the trough, okay? Makes sense. Okay, so the amplitude is the distance above or below the center line, and the frequency is the number of cycles per second. Now, to go one cycle here, which is a wavelength, so let's see, a wavelength would be, for example, from here to here. That is a wavelength. It really can be anywhere. That is the wave length. But you can measure it, LNGTH, there we go. Or you can go from here to here. That is one complete cycle through the waveform, where it goes above it, below it, and back to the x-axis again. The next thing I'd like to talk about is phase shift. So let's say that we have two microphones on an acoustic guitar. So if this mic is 6 inches away from the guitar, and this is 12 inches away, it's going to take twice as long for the sound to reach that microphone as it is for this, and it's going to create phase problems. That time lag is called phase shift. Now, if you superimpose the two microphone waveforms on top of one another, they're going to look like this. That time discrepancy right there is going to create a phase shift. Did you ever wonder why recording engineers, at least good ones, put the overhead mics at the same height? It's so the sound of the drums will reach the microphones at the same time. If you want the snare to be in the center of the stereo image, then you need to place the mic the same distance away from the center of the snare. Let's say it's 46 inches there and 46 inches there. Another tip for drum recording, have your drummer place their main crash cymbals at the same height so that it takes the same amount of time to reach the overheads. It'll prevent a lot of phasing problems, and it'll also have your crashes be at the same relative volumes. I've had many drummers say, oh, that's really awkward, I don't play like that. And I say, trust me, it's going to sound a lot better. And virtually every time after we've done the drum session and they listen to the drums, they end up setting their kit up that way from then on. Now let's look at some practical examples of this. We're going to start out with double miking a guitar cabinet. Okay, I want to talk about how I have the cabinet mic. This cabinet is a 1960B straight Marshall cabinet with vintage 30s in it. On this speaker, I have a Shure SM57 that is right where the dust cover meets the speaker cone. It's actually right in between there, and that's picking up the top end of the sound. And then for the mids and the low end, I have the Sennheiser MD421, which is actually in between the dust cover and the edge of the speaker. The amp we're going to be using is an old Sovtek Midget 50H from the early 90s. Okay, so we've got the amp mic'd up, going through two Neve 1073s. They're BAE ones. And Rhett's going to play a clean picking part. I'm going to hit the phase button, throwing it out of phase, and you're going to hear the sound change radically. Rhett? Now I have the Sovtek Midget 50 set to a distorted sound. You're really going to hear the difference when we change the phase. I'm going to play a single chord here, and Rhett will change the phase. Virtually goes away. Put it back in. You can really hear when it's out of phase. It should be very obvious. Let's take a look at the waveforms in Pro Tools. Okay, here's the distorted guitar part. I'm going to zoom in on the waveform so you can see what an in-phase, what two in-phase mics look like. This is the SM57 here, okay? And this is the MD421, the Sennheiser. You see all the things are going exactly the same way. They look identical. Even though they're on different speakers, they look identical. This is the track that I've bounced down right here, okay? I bounced these two tracks to this heavy guitar bounce here. Okay, now, if I go to the part where I flip the phase, you can see right here, for example, that the phase has been flipped. You can see the amplitude go way, way down. And if we look at the phase of the waveforms, you can see that they're going exactly in the opposite directions. Right here, this is going upward, this is going downward. You see they're mirror images. They're completely inverted now from what they were. That is an out of phase sound. So you can see every time I flip the phase, it goes away to virtually nothing. So here we're in phase. If we look, you can see it's very easy to see. Everything lines up, and then we immediately go right down to here. And we are out of phase right here. Zoom in. And everything's going exactly in the opposite direction here. Next, we're moving on to recording acoustic guitar with two microphones. So microphones that I'm using here are SR30s made by Earthworks. They're really, really great sounding microphones, as you'll hear in a minute. I have them placed, this one to catch the low end from the body and the other one to catch the top end from the fingerboard and the neck. They're both, I would say, probably about 8 inches away, and they're equal distance, as you'll see from this angle. They're both the same distance away from the guitar, and we're going to get a great sound with this. Let's check it out. The mic pre's we're going to use for the acoustic guitar are these Neve 1081s. Now, I have the EQ engaged, but I don't have any EQ on. I'm just doing that so it goes through the circuit to add a little extra color. When I hit the phase button here on one of the mics, it's going to sound like the acoustic guitar jumps outside the speaker. One of the reasons for this is that since I have one microphone with a space pair on the neck where the high end's coming from and the low end coming from the other mic on the body, you're actually getting two completely different tonalities between the two mics. So the phasing is going to do something different. It's not like we're recording through two speakers with the same sound coming out of both of them. This is actually a little bit more sophisticated in phasing, but you'll hear it just jump outside the speakers. Let's check it out. Let's take a look at it in Pro Tools. And it goes out of phase right there. You'll hear it sound like it goes outside the speakers. I'm going to zoom in. We're going to look at the in-phase waveform first. So here we are. Let's go right here. See what it looks like in phase. It looks like it's going exactly in the same direction. You can see it there. You can see the two different areas of the waveforms. They're all going in the same direction there, right? They look very similar. I mean, this one's a little bit more jagged than that and everything. That's because you got one that's getting the high end, one that's getting the low end. Then, when we get to the part where it flips the phase, you can see I have a little dirty pot in there, and you can see that it makes a little crackling. Hear that sound? That's it's right here. You can see it. But then when I go to here, you can see it's out of phase. See how these bits are this is facing up, this is facing down, this is facing up, this is facing down. So they are completely out of phase with each other. It's very easy to see, easier to hear. Back in phase there. I'll show you what the in phase looks like again. Once again, here we go. There. You can see that the crest here and the trough, they're both going, the troughs are going the same way and the crests are going the same way. When it's out of phase, it's just the opposite. See, this is out of phase. You have a crest here and you have a trough there. I want to show you something here regarding using a spaced pair on acoustic guitar. Because you've got a microphone here picking up the top end on the next side, and you have the other microphone same distance away picking up the bottom end, the waveforms are going to look and sound different. Let's check it out in Pro Tools. This particular microphone, you can see that the waveforms are in phase with each other, right? Everything's going the same direction, but this one is much more jagged than this one. This has a much smoother contour. This mic is the one that's picking up the high end, whereas this is the low end, so the waveforms of because it's picking up more low end, it actually has a smoother contour. Okay, now Rhett is going to strum something, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip one side out of phase while he's strumming. Rhett? So once again, you can hear that the low end sounds like it disappears, and when you have a space pair like this on an acoustic guitar, it sounds like the sound actually jumps out of the speakers. That's how you know it's out of phase. Now we're going to move from a space pair, which is what we've just had, to an XY pair, to where the cardioid capsules are at a 90-degree angle with each other. I'm still using the Earthworks. Let's check it out. Okay, so I have the microphones in an XY pair right now, probably 8 to 10 inches away from the guitar. Let's take a listen to it in the control room. Now I'm going to have Rhett strum so that you can hear it. Next, let's do it on some held chords. It'll be easier to hear. Okay, we're moving on to miking a drum set. We're going to look at the phase between the kick in and kick out mic and between the snare top and snare bottom mic. I'm going to have my assistant Maxton play the drums for us. Okay, let me hear the kick. Now I'm going to flip the phase on the kick out. Go ahead. So that's out of phase. I'm going to put it back in phase. Okay, I want to hear the snare now. Now I'm going to flip the phase on the snare bottom. Okay, again. When the snare top and bottom are out of phase, it's very easy to hear if you get the mic levels identical. It just sounds incredibly thin. All the bottom end goes away. Next, we're going to move to Pro Tools and see what these individual hits look like. You're going to notice when the waves are moving in the same direction, they're going to be in phase. And when they're moving in opposite directions, they're going to be out of phase. Let's check it out. Okay, if you take a look at the wave, this is the kick in right here, and this is the kick out. You'll notice that the kick out is slightly behind the kick in. You can move it, but you don't really need to. This is where the kick in starts right there. So it's slightly behind. It's about 1 millisecond behind. I'm looking at the length in seconds. You can actually look at it in samples if you'd like. So it's like 58 samples or 60 samples, something like that, before the attack happens. These two are not lined up perfectly, but that's not going to affect your low end. I could, like I said, go like this and drag it back there. That'd be perfectly in phase. That it would sound like it has more bottom end, but it's not going to make that big of a difference. And people have been recording kicks like that forever. Now here's the out of phase kick drum. Once again, you can see there's just the opposite. You have the crest there, and you have the trough there. Okay, so that is a almost perfectly out of phase. If it was perfectly out of phase, it'd look like that. Now, they're two different microphones, so they're going to have two different sounds, but that's a perfectly out of phase kick drum right there. Okay, let's take a look at the snare drum. Okay, here's the snare top, and this is the snare bottom. See how they're perfectly in phase. The crests are happening right at the same time. You know, this is, once again, this is time delayed a little bit because you have the width of the snare, or the depth, however you want to think of it. So it's going to be a few, it's going to be a few samples behind it here. If I had to look at it, it's 12 samples behind. That's how long it takes for it to get from one mic to the next. So if I move to my out of phase sample, you're going to notice once again that they are perfectly out of phase here. You have a crest there, you have a trough there. This waveform actually goes down as a trough first because it's moving away from the microphone, okay? And the air is moving towards the microphone there. That is an out of phase snare. Since we went to the trouble of miking up the drums, Maxon's going to play for a second. Next, we're going to look at how to make sure your bass DI and bass amplifier are in phase with each other. Phase between the DI of a bass and the bass amp is also something that you need to be aware of. The bass amp is going to be slightly behind your DI, meaning your direct input. So I have the bass plugged in here, my Fender Jazz. I'm going through the Little Labs splitter box. I'm taking one of the outputs and I'm going into this Neve 1073 here on the top. That's my bass DI in. The other one is going to my bass amp here, a little Ampeg bass amp that's being mic'd in the other room. And I'm recording both signals at the same time. So I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to go into record and I'm just going to play. All right, I'm going to look at the two bass parts. We've got the bass DI here, and we have the bass amplifier right down below. You're going to notice you have to look kind of near where the beginning of the notes happen, the transient. You're going to see that the bass amp is slightly behind. Here's the DI. I'm just going to cut this part, and I'm going to cut this part of the bass amp and bass DI. Now, in the old days, they used to put a delay on the bass DI so it would move back and it would be in phase. You see how it lines up nicely. But you can do the same thing here where you just slide it up into phase and slide out the back part. Then you get both the amp and the DI where they're nice and in phase, and it's going to sound super fat. Well, that should answer most of your questions about phase. There are some more complex phase things that you can do. You can use phase as an effect, making it out of phase and making things sound like they come from beyond the speakers, like we have with the acoustic guitar. You can actually use for a cool effect. You also can have things where you're using distant miking on an amplifier along with a close mic and blend them and actually get a really, really cool sound, even if they're not perfectly in phase. That's all for now. Please subscribe here to my Everything Music YouTube channel. If you're interested in the Beato book, go to my website at www.rickbeato.com and become a member of the Beato Club. It's a way that you can support this channel. Go to the website and check it out. Thanks for watching.